It looks like something out of Department of Defense, like you're in the Space Force or something like that.
Okay, we're streaming live on YouTube now.
Okay.
Should we go ahead and start the meeting, Ben?
Is Loyal back in there again? I don't see his box, but is it just because we don't have them all on there? There we go.
I think he might have logged out and back in again.
It doesn't look like Loyal is on.
No, I don't see him yet. Let's wait. Let's wait till he gets on before we start.
It looks like he's back on, and I think as long as he can hear us, it's the main thing, right?
Can you hear us, Loyal? Yeah, he's not on the participant list yet.
Should I text him?
Yeah, why don't you try and do that?
Okay.
And if nothing else, he could call into the meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, this is him. He's coming back.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Broadcaster. Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you, but there you go. We can see you too.
Perfect.
All right.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started since everybody is here. I'm sitting in on behalf of Suzanne Case. Dave Smith is out on leave this week, so I'll be representing the department. And I do have one announcement, which is Lauren is, this is her last week with DLNR. And she's going to be, her last day is Friday, and she's going to be going to Fish and Wildlife Service starting Monday. So congratulations to her. And definitely want to thank her for all the great and hard work she's done for the department.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Ooh, Michelle, stop stealing our people.
God, how many is it now?
This one is not my fault, I swear, but I am greatly appreciative that Lauren is joining our team and sincerely grateful for all the work that she's done for all the joint projects over the last couple of years.
Lauren, you're just carrying on the tradition of Loyal, who kept stealing our people too.
Yes, blame him.
So Michelle, is Lauren going to be assigned to ESRC with you? Or is she running away from it?
I'll let Lauren answer that one.
Actually, I'll be on the Mariana Islands team, so I'll actually be working for Michelle.
Okay.
So that's good.
Oh, congratulations, Lauren.
And bad.
And thanks for everything you've done. You've been really a great help for the committee.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate you saying that.
Just in time to deal with the Cocos Island problem.
Yes. Out of the what is it? Out of the frying pan and into the fire.
So does that mean that we're gonna be then main contact then would be with COA?
Yeah, so COA, just continue to work with COA, and hopefully they'll replace my position in the next few months. And he'll be supplemented by some other staff will be helping out with his workload, but COA will be the point of contact in the HCP section. So you might still see Kate Cullison, email, work with you on some things. She's still on our staff.
Okay.
And a few other people like Afshin.
Good. Okay, great. Well, congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for everything. You've been great.
Thanks, Kavika.
Okay, so I guess we should go around and everyone state their name and agency and they're here. And then if there's no objection, I was gonna suggest having Lauren facilitate the meeting for today.
Afshin, you want to just call out names? That might be easier.
Okay, sure. So I'll start. I guess I didn't say my name earlier. I'm Afshin Siddiqui, and I'm with the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So then we have Jim Jacoby.
Good morning. I'm Jim Jacoby, co-representing with Gordon Tribble for USGS Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center.
Thanks, Jim. Michelle.
Michelle Bogardus, representing U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Good morning, everyone.
And Kavika.
Kavika Winter, at-large member.
Loyal.
Loyal Merhoff, at-large member as well.
Lisa.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Spain. I'm an at-large member as well. I'm on Hawaii Island.
Melissa.
I'm Melissa Price, representing University of Hawaii at Manoa.
Great. I think that is all the committee members that are represented here today.
For the record, who's representing USGS today for any decision making?
It'll be Jim.
Thanks, Gordon.
And then maybe DOFA staff, we can have them introduce themselves. So Lauren.
Yep, so until Friday, I'm the Habitat Conservation Planning Coordinator for DOFA. My name is Lauren Taylor.
And COA.
I'm Koa Matsuoka. I'm the HCP Habitat Conservation Planning Associate with DOFA.
Thanks, COA. And I think Kate, Kate is on too.
Yep, this is Kate, also from DOFA.
Hey, Kate.
And then Linda.
Deputy Attorney General Linda Chow. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have Gordon. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, yes, Gordon Tribble. I work with Jim Jacoby at USGS. Thank you.
Okay. And then I think Fish and Wildlife Service, we have Rebecca.
Yeah, hi, I'm Becca Frazier with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Great, thanks. And then we have a few other people on the line. There's some phone numbers, and then I see Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Matt Stelmach. I'm with Tetra Tech. I've been working on HCPs from the applicant side.
Great, thanks, Matt. And then Tom?
Thanks, Afshin. Tom Stetzinger with Tetra Tech also, and been working, helping support compliance and development of wind HCPs in Hawaii.
Great, thanks, Tom. And then I have two phone numbers, so sorry, I don't know. Maybe we can do the 808-929-9244.
This is Sandra Demerel, and I'm from Nalehu, and I'd like to speak on, I have an oral testimony. Thank you.
And then I have one more number, 808-785-2058.
And if you need to *6, I believe, to unmute. Or we may be able to unmute you for you. I'll try. If you'd like to introduce yourself. No, won't let me unmute. *6 on a telephone.
Hi, this is Linda Morgan. I'm representing Friends of Ka'u Bats.
Great, thank you. I think that's everyone. Did I miss anyone on the call? Okay, good. All right, so I will hand it over to Lauren.
Oh, okay. Are we done with announcements? Was that it? For anybody else? But I have one thing if no one else wants to just hop on and interrupt me. I don't know if we can decide this today, but I'd like to put it out there for scheduling the regularly scheduled meeting dates for 2021. So we can doodle poll this afterwards if anybody needs to, but you know, previously in the past, it had always been the third Thursday of the fiscal quarter, each fiscal quarter. Then we moved, I believe we're on the third Wednesday, except for when we have extra meetings like this that are called. Does third Wednesday of each fiscal quarter still work, or do people have other standing meetings? Or we can decide this through email, but while I have everybody, it may be easier to get a consensus now. So does anybody have objection to third Wednesday of the fiscal quarter? And for your calendar, those dates would be January 21st. I'm sorry, Wednesday, sorry. So it'd be January 20th. April 21st. July 21st. And October 20th.
Gordon, is that when we have our Pacific meeting? On the third Thursday?
It's the fourth. It's when we're talking Wednesday. And it's the following week. It's the fourth Wednesday. So that works.
Okay. We're good. Good.
Okay.
Yeah, I
What
was
was
just looking at that.
final date, Lauren?
Was
What was the
October 20th?
October 20. Okay.
Yes. And so
And also, when is our, we have another one in November, is that correct? This November?
nothing is scheduled for the remainder of the year yet,
Okay.
but everybody watching or participating right now do expect that there may be one, possibly even two more meetings before the end of the year. They'll be smaller, sort of condensed ones, or like these, or we're just having one topic. So, you know, just because of sitting through a Zoom call can be, you know, kind of difficult.
Yeah.
And then
did they make a decision on the timing of HCC? I don't know if they were looking at that third week of July.
It was decided, I wasn't there. Gordon, do you remember what the date was? Let's see, I think I have it.
Mom, it's Jackson's birthday today.
sorry, got homeschool next to me.
Yeah, I don't have it written in my calendar here.
Okay, so we'll say those are tentative dates. Obviously, they're never 100% confirmed until they're sunshine, but we'll put those as tentative dates. And then if we have to adjust for a major reason, or if we don't have quorum, we'll do that in the year. And then one additional thing before we get moving on. These expect for the time being, until you hear differently, that these will still be Zoom meetings. And we'll just, you know, take it as the situation evolves with COVID. But the other thing, if we can do right now, is the
Happy birthday.
someone's birthday in kindergarten.
Is it?
I'm trying to ask something, or I would mute myself. The annual review meetings, do we want to do a back-to-back with that January meeting, or would you like those scheduled for another?
I recommend scheduling them. Since we're sort of focusing on a shorter period of time for meetings, I'd recommend we schedule them separately, so we can really focus on them.
Okay, so we'll doodle poll to find 2 days together in January, and then if that doesn't work, we'll look into February or March at worst case.
And Lauren, I know that this will not be your job, but if there's any way that we can get those materials as early as humanly possible, that would be great. I always struggle every year on reviewing all of the materials in time for.
You just got muted.
Yeah, well, actually, probably by the end of, what month are we in, October? I would say by the end of this month, we should have all the annual reports finalized, at least with DOFA and Fish and Wildlife Service staff. So obviously they won't have gone through ESRC review, but we can certainly post those and push out that link for everyone's awareness. We post those separately on the website, you know, in addition to when we post them for our meetings. So yes, we can get that out early so you have time to digest.
Thank you.
If there's no other announcements from the committee, the topic today is this meeting will be a similar format to the last ESRC meeting, where we're really just addressing at this point the public comments on the BAT guidance update and the sort of key findings that came out of the BAT workshop that are relevant. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to share screen on that. And
You're getting the beat.
so if you're watching online, please get the newest matrix from the website. Sometimes we get late public testimony, and we do try our best to add those to the meeting materials. So we've added a little bit more to the matrix. So I'm going to share my screen. This is the newest version. And we can work through, if nobody has any objections, the second half of the paper and sort of go from where we left off. I'll try to make this bigger, and I'll minimize this window here in a minute. Oh, and just one other thing I wanted to say for committee's consideration when we get into deliberation, or when you get into deliberation, I should say, is that we will be ending by about 11. We need to be off the call by about 11:30 because this is a shared Zoom account for the state, and another committee has superseded us at that point. So there was one other thing I wanted to suggest, and I don't, I'll let the committee decide. This is for your decision, not mine, but how do I make this big again? Never mind. Well, do we want to take public comments or public testimony now before we go through, bearing in mind that some people are waiting on the line, or would you rather do it after each section or at the end of the review this morning again? So I'll just put that out to the committee to make the decision before I start.
I would recommend we do it before we get into the discussion of the matrix, just to give the people wanting to provide testimony the time to do that upfront.
I have no objections any way you want to do it.
Okay, is that a consensus then? Okay, how do I make this big again? Do I press this arrow? Never mind, I'll just stop sharing. I'll let, so we can see the public can see the screen for the, there we go, for the public testimony part, and I'll let you run through this since you're facilitating the meeting.
Okay, sure. Yeah, do we want to go ahead and start off with Sandra Demerol? You wanted to give your testimony now?
Thank you very much. This is very kind of you to open up the testimony early for those of us, especially me this morning. I have another testimony to give to the county council here in Hawaii. Appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. Again, I'm with the Friends of the Ka'u Bats, and I wanted to speak to you about my position and how I came to be doing this. I really believe that what we're doing as mitigation down here is what we're offering as a solution for the bats in Ka'u is really something that is, I hate to say it, but divinely ordained. It came to me as an idea to reach out to the community because what had been presented to us by the Twahiri group is to plant trees up in a forest that's already being planted by other people. In fact, we volunteer ourselves to go up there and plant trees. So it seemed kind of giving the community, kind of an insult to the community to spend $1.5 million on planting trees that we were already voluntarily planting. So in fact, what I did was somehow this idea came to me to count the bats to save the bats. And the reason I believe this was divinely inspired is because if anybody who knows me knows I never think in short sentences. You will hear me go on for hours. And so I really did feel that counting the bats to save the bats down here in Ka'u would open up people's minds to it. And the first person that came on board and really gave me an impetus to actually do this is Linda Morgan. Now, I'd like to introduce her because she's the person who's actually if I'm sort of the inspiration for this group, Linda is definitely the person who's, I'll say, actualized it. She's taken it out and actually working with children and working with people in the community, whereas I'm kind of a bookish person, as anybody who knows me knows, and a very, very wordy person. She's a very down-to-earth human being who is a librarian. She's a teacher and a librarian. In fact, both of us are teachers with very different approaches, as you can imagine. But Linda is actually working with children, and I hate to say this, but once again, I will date myself by saying she's working with the very brightest and the best children in our community, at least the very brightest. And consequently, she's inspiring them to work with bats. And we have got a large number of people inspired. We have reached out to Bats Conservation International, and we're all inspired by Merlin Tuttle's work, if not terrified by what he's done. Some of his adventures in quicksand and such are truly terrifying. And I happen to be named Sandra Tuttle. So I have a very big connection with this as well. I just feel that what we're doing is mitigation on a real scale. While none of us individually will be able to create a real bat, nobody ever made a bat but another bat, by raising awareness in the community, we really feel that we've saved bats because people are looking for bats that were conscious of them. And we have many people in our community, right from my acupuncturist who said, "Why do we need bats?" to me, and we discussed it while I was laying there with my needle stuck in. So it's really amazing how we're reaching out to people just one by one, talking to them, and have raised the awareness of bats in our community enormously. And I really believe that this organization will take off. I can fund it, I believe, through HCPs because I'm now holding the county's feet to the fire and making them do Section 7s whenever it comes up. And Section 10s when they come up, because they want to do Section 7s, but I pointed out to them that the county and the state are not eligible for Section 7 consultations under ESA. And so I'm kind of the hammer here, and Linda is definitely the one who's working in the community and working with people. So with that, I'd like to end and turn it over to Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Linda, please go ahead and give your testimony.
Hi. As Sandra said, I'm the school librarian at Alehu School, and my assignment this year with the COVID is to work on a project-based system with GT kids, gifted and talented, as well as other duties. But because last school year, before it closed down because of the pandemic, I've been working with 2 different grade levels, teaching them about our hoary bat in the program that involves Kamehameha schools called EK Hawaii. And the basis of this, or the premise, is that place-based education will boost kids' self-concept. And I can't imagine a better place-based connection for kids to boost their self-esteem than to help save an endangered species. And although the kids started out with the "ew, bats" kind of attitude, through learning about bats, they've become bat soldiers. They want to save our bats. And it's not just the kids. Their families are involved as well as other community members. And at the one meeting we had before the pandemic shut down, being able to have meetings, we had 26 people in attendance of all ages, from a few months to in their 80s. And we believe these people we can expand their interest. I've found other people that already love bats and now are really into our Opeapea. And we're hoping that you can provide us some funding to be able to get some bat scientists once a month at meetings that will train us so we can be better at sighting bats. We have quite a few people. One of my friends is out every morning and every evening at bat time, and it's definite we have way fewer bats here in Ka'u than we used to. And we have theories about the reasons for it, one of them being all of the SO2 bog we had from the Puna eruption. And I live in Ocean View, and the wind current took that bog directly to Ocean View and really affected us there. And we're believing that it killed the insects that the bats are that depending on, as well as bats. Now that's our theory, of course. It's only a theory at this point, but we'd love to be able to learn more on how to count the bats accurately and then come up with ways to promote their reproduction. I've lived in my house in Ocean View for 19 years, never had mosquito problems like this year. And I think a lot of it is because we have so many fewer bats. At any rate, this is what we are hoping you will find funding for us so that we can provide mitigation measures to have more bats. We miss the bats. The whole ecosystem needs the bats, and hopefully your committee will see through to help us with our efforts. Thank you very much for letting us testify early. That is really helpful to us, and I appreciate all of the committee members' efforts to save our bats. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda, for your testimony. Next, we'll
You're
have
welcome.
Matt Stelmach.
Hi, Koa. Thank you. I have a few topics I'd like to discuss. I'm open to participating on more conversational, as these topics come up, I'd be happy to discuss them in context, but I'm open to submitting comment now if that's your preference. So I guess that's a question for you or the committee. What works?
I appreciate your interaction on the various topics, Matt. If you want to, give sort of an opening statement, that would be fine too. It works for me.
Sure. Here, I can share my
But
video.
that's just my opinion. Up to the rest of the community in terms of how to proceed.
Fine with me.
Okay, well, maybe I'll give you an overview of the topics I'd like to discuss today, and then we can discuss them in more detail as we work through. So I just wanted to touch on 3 of the topics listed on the agenda today: mitigation, adaptive management, and the population viability analysis. The mitigation first, I've been involved in drafting mitigation for several plans, and I think that the mitigation we've written for the Oahe and Kaweloa HCP amendments was some of the first mitigation to be implemented or go through the ESRC approval process since the first ESRC bat guidance was voted for approval. And so some of the challenges that I faced in that was the prescriptive mitigation. I think that the prescriptive mitigation decreases the likelihood of innovation. And I've heard multiple times over meetings that we don't know how to create bats. And essentially what I hear when I hear that is that we need innovation in order to move from this presumption, essentially a presumption that we need native forest creation to impact bats, as opposed to what we're starting to see from the consensus in literature is that native forest may not be the best mitigation option. And my suggestion or request is that following the discussion at the last ESRC meeting, that we move to a suite of options or a methodology for approval rather than a prescriptive mitigation strategy. I think that we really have an opportunity to move forward, integrate the bat into our contemporary society. And the only way to do that is to have literature-based mitigation, have that supported by the best available science and effective monitoring. The second piece to touch on in terms of mitigation is the acreage per bat. I'm concerned in 2 fundamental aspects. One, assigning a core use area per bat doesn't account for the variation in core use size or habitat contained within that restored area, which is also likely correlated with the core use size. So I think we should be looking deeper than the number. We should be looking at the habitat contained and how that affects a bat's survival and reproduction. And the second is that acres per bat does not account for the long-term benefits of habitat protection. An acre doesn't equal 1 bat or 2 acres or 10 acres. An acre provides a bat with the habitat it needs in order to survive and reproduce. And so we need to consider, if these habitats are protected in the long term, how does that affect the bat population in the long term? And then on adaptive management, we introduced the concept of a reversion trigger in both the Kawailoa and Oahe HCP amendments. And this was really strongly opposed by the ESRC at the time. Objectively, what I'd like to see is to incentivize initial minimization measures that provide strong protections for the species, with the ability for the HCP holders to relax those minimization measures as we better understand the risk to the species. So start with high protections and work backwards, as opposed to the current strategy seems to be opposite. Start really low and then incrementally increase with no opportunity to bring those minimization measures back down. And so that could be that could be a reversion trigger, and that could be seasonal increases in curtailment or other minimization measures. And the last is the population viability analysis. I wanted to have an opportunity to discuss the limits of an unconstrained population model, and then the importance of density dependent changes in the population. So if you guys would like to involve me in the discussion as you work through, please let me know. I'd be happy to participate in more detail.
Matt, I got a question for you, at least to your first point, which, and I philosophically agree with the point that you made, that there needs to be room for innovation. And when you guys presented your mitigation plans, I believe I praised you for your innovation and out of the box thinking. And part of the challenge is, though, that some applicants aren't as innovative as you guys, and they just want to be told what they need to do. So how can we balance that from your perspective?
I would envision a reference to the best available science, where we see the pieces that correlate with increased bat activity. And we have a few studies now, both from the mainland and from Hawaii, looking at how insect abundance correlates with bat activity and other habitat features that correlate with increased bat activity. And so I think it's fine to make recommendations, but my concern is that, I guess the piece that was most challenging to me, especially for Oahe, was that because the ESRC bat guidance was prescriptive about 40 acres of forest per bat, if the mitigation didn't meet that target, it was very difficult to fit into that framework. And so, say for Oahe, there were concerns that maybe we should only be counting the area of the forest or some buffer around the forest. But really, I think the plan that we came up with for Oahe really has a great opportunity to incorporate the bat into the contemporary landscape. And so maybe if the recommendations have more flexibility into them or incorporate the range, as Linda suggested at the last meeting, it allows for direction provided by the ESRC with the opportunity for innovation.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Melissa, can I ask you what you think about that?
If it's okay, I'd like to just give it a little more time to think about it. Sorry to step back from that, but yeah, I want to just think about it a little bit more, but thank you.
Okay, let's be sure to touch on that when it comes up in the future.
Just wanted to add a couple of comments too. Thanks, Matt, for all the work you put into that. I think all of us are really challenged with trying to come up with what is adequate mitigation to offset take that we're either seeing or expecting or potentially going to be seeing in the future. I just want to clarify one thing, and I think we're trying to really make this much more clear in the introductory part of the guidance. Is this is a guidance. It's not meant to be prescriptive per se. It is meant to be, this is our best from the perspective of the ESRC and the agencies involved. This is our best understanding in terms of where we are relative to the various issues surrounding bats and their potential impacts from projects such as wind farms. We're definitely not trying to be prescriptive, thou shalt do this and so forth. It is more of this is our understanding. And what we're trying to point out is based upon our understanding of where things are at this point, these are the things that we would expect to come in from a project. But if you have other ideas, we're very open to having those presented to the committee, and with the background and the evidence, so that potentially if there is a better solution, we're very anxious to jump on that. So I want to make sure that it's well understood that we are not intending this to be a prescriptive management, but it's just, again, it's our best understanding of the situation and the potential impacts and potential options for mitigation of offset. But we are open for other things. But please convince us. That's what we're basically saying. So thanks for your comments.
Okay, if there's no more responses to Matt's testimony, we'll go ahead and Tom Snetzinger, please go ahead and give your testimony.
Great. Thank you, Cohen. Thanks for the opportunity to provide some testimony at today's meeting. Tetra Tech provided extensive comments as part of a written submittal back in January, and I'm not going to add to those at this point. However, I would like to sort of touch on the process moving forward. And I know there was some discussion at the last meeting that unless the governor's order was extended, that there would be a requirement for in-person meetings following this one. But I think Lauren suggested we would be doing Zoom meetings into the future. So I'd like some discussion about that, and also sort of to gain understanding about how or if the public would be able to participate remotely in those in-person meetings. So does an in-person meeting mean in-person exclusively, or just in-person for the ESRC committee members and the public able to join in a variety of through a variety of technologies, or in person? And then I guess the other request that I would make in terms of sort of allowing full participation and review of upcoming draft of a revised that guidance document would be to provide that well in advance of the official announcement of the upcoming ESRC meeting, which generally gives us about a week to quickly review and provide comments on it. And I'd really like to have more time to sort of dig into a document the size of this with sort of the background research that's needed to look at, or that we need to look at it in order to give it a full review. I think that's it. I'll listen to your comments, and I'll be available throughout the meeting. So if there are topics that come up, I would appreciate an opportunity to sort of have an opportunity to revisit those at the end or during the meeting, so that I can respond to things that strike me through the ESRC's conversation. Thank you.
Well, let me respond to his question regarding the meetings and what they will look like in the future. So right now we're operating remotely via that is being authorized through the emergency proclamation that is currently in place. If and when the emergency proclamation is no longer continued or extended, and the laws have not changed that allow for these types of meetings via interactive technology, then we will have to go back to in-person meetings. Traditionally, the in-person meetings have not allowed for testimony via interactive technology, other than potentially through a phone-in type of technology. I know some boards have allowed for that, but generally it would be, if it's in person, it's generally all in person. But then again, we have an emerging landscape with regards to technology and its use in these types of meetings. So we'll just have to see where it goes from then. But in the past, in-person meetings means everybody is in person. Okay, F. Sheener, I'm not hearing you. I'm not sure if it's just me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, now I can't hear you.
We're all muted, that's why.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why I have such a hard time with this. I was just gonna comment on Tom's respond to Tom's second comment. I think we talked about this before within staff, but I think it would be a good idea if we can put out the BAT guidance document, earlier than 1 week before a meeting, but the revised document earlier than 1 week before a meeting for the public to review. Because I do agree 1 week is not a lot of time, and that's what's required under our laws for sunshine. But I think we can commit to providing the document at least when we provide it to the committee, which is usually a month before our meeting. So unless anyone has anything else to say, I would say we'll commit to that.
I think that's reasonable. And we, just to be clear for everybody watching, we haven't made any changes to the draft since that January version. So you're not missing anything or behind on any revisions. We're still looking at that original version that was been sunshine for 10 months. So, but yeah, as we do make substantive changes, we'll try to get those out 30 days before, as Afshin said, and also maybe we can track change those so it's flagged, so it's a little easier for you to be focused on what's changed for your review.
And just to add, that's precisely the purpose of this meeting and the one before it, which is to go through the comments from the public and have that discussion that then feeds into the revision. And so that's why the comments now are extremely helpful.
Okay, great. Any more comments in response to Tom's testimony? Okay, hearing none, I guess I'll hand it back to Lauren to go over the comment matrix.
Okay, so I'm going to share screen again. And I'm going to make this small. Okay, just unmute yourself and flag me down if I can't see everybody on here, if you're not being acknowledged. And I'm sorry that's not bigger. Hopefully you can follow along on your copies of this as well. So we're going to start with mitigation in this meeting. And I'm just going to do what I did last time and just go through each section. And then, I'm going to pause after each topic and please just jump in so we can move through and stay on target for our time. I don't know if we'll need a break this morning. Maybe we can just power through, but we'll see how we go. So yep, just cut me off if you need to. So the first topic under mitigation was similar to one that we received for overall for the guidance. I believe this was in the background, the introduction section. But this is basically that the recommendations in the mitigation increase the costs to an unfeasible level and would, prevent future renewable energy investment in the islands. And also that the mitigation cost that was cited or explained in the document of $125,000 was unjustified for the core use area.
Just to comment on that I understand the challenges. You know, the charge of the ESRC though is to really look at the biology involved relative to the projects proposed for both safe harbors and habitat conservation plans. And I think we should always be considering making sure that any recommendations that are coming out are as effective and are efficient and effective as possible. But you know, the ESRC is really committed, at least this is my interpretation of why we're here, is really committed to making sure that the biology surrounding the issues is sound and solid, and allows us to best assess the impacts and potential solutions, mitigation offsets for any take of listed species. So it's a very important consideration, but in some ways this is really not part of our charge, is just my opinion on it.
Okay, if there's any other thoughts on that. So,
Mrs. Loyal?
Yes, sir.
I have one. So, yeah, the 125 for mitigation is as it ties back to the cost for research, right? So the mitigation discussion in the draft guidance is an acreage based one. And then the translation to monetary amounts was for the research as mitigation aspect, if I remember correctly. So paraphrasing this just as mitigation cost isn't quite, I don't think, correct. But you know, you're right. I mean, part of the things that we're going to look at is from this comment is that appropriate to be tying that to the regular mitigation costs. So I assume that we'll be looking at that as we go forward in the revision. That's it. Thanks.
Just one other note, a technical thing, I think it should be 40%, not 400% on that comment. Is that right?
I'll have to ask COA to check that, what the original comment letter said.
Because the original white paper said, suggested 50,000. So I don't know. Anyway, just a minor.
Okay, we'll confirm with what was in the letter that was submitted by Marilyn. Okay. So we did hear from these two commenters this morning, and they've submitted a potential mitigation option for applicants under these plans, and so I've summarized their comments here. You've all received that, and that's posted. But these commenters are recommending that the community could be engaged through the use of citizen science in as a mitigation option.
Just a quick comment here, and I'm sorry that both of them have left the meeting at this point. I was going to say something to them. I really appreciate their enthusiasm and efforts that they're doing in terms of engaging more of the general public and students in particular in terms of understanding the presence and the ecology and the importance of the Hawaiian hoary bat. I think it's really important to do, and I'd like to see more of that. The question I've got is whether that by itself really fits into the picture of mitigation options, which really gets me to a bigger topic, which is where I think this is one of the things in our revision we need to be really focused on is trying to link as best as possible mitigation to limiting factors. In other words, and part of the biggest problem we have is we just don't really understand enough right now to be able to step from take to mitigation very, very cleanly. And I think we're all trying to come up with what the best answers are, how to link these together. So it's, that's again, part of what we're trying to do with this document is say this is our best understanding so far, but we are certainly open to new ideas and so forth. That being said, is though again, I appreciate what they and others have done in terms of community engagement, but I question how we can tie that directly to mitigation.
Okay, if there's no more comments on that, I did just want to, COA did just check, and it's, the letter did say 400%. So maybe it's incorporating the mitigation and monitoring costs, like the overall expense. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but that's what's in the comment. So at any rate, I think the main point is just pointing out the significant cost increase. If mitigation was implemented and monitoring as fully as all the recommendations in the document. So the next section, which Matt, one of our commenters, touched on and was brought up by several in several of our comment letters, is the concept of native reforestation. So the first aspect of this that was touched on was that there's no research or data that demonstrates that native forests produce more bats. And actually the best available science has shown that not to be the case. Just jump in here. I'll just keep kind of moving through this section. Maybe we can talk about it.
I don't think it's so much that it hasn't shown that to be the case, as we still just don't have enough good information in terms of really understanding what habitat is needed. And I think this gets into also the challenge. And I think part of the confusion that I constantly see in both proposals and discussion and even our documents is there are different kinds of habitat. There's roosting habitat, there's pupping habitat, there's foraging habitat, and in many cases those get glommed into just the word habitat, and it's very confusing. And I think the discussions could go different directions depending on which those are and the options for mitigation potentially there. But again, I think the biggest problem is we're still trying to get more information to better understand what those limiting factors are and what habitat quality means relative to mitigation.
Go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, so I mean, this one gets talked about a lot. And, when Jim started out talking about, the purpose of the guidance and what we were trying to do with this is kind of another segment on that same topic, and that because we don't have really strong methods of monitoring to get populations of bats on an island basis, coupled with the fact that we don't have good documentation on how to increase the population size of bats, we therefore have kind of a lot of difficulty getting to the point where projects that may be having a significant impact on bat populations can be offset and mitigated, because we don't have those two very important aspects that we typically use when we try to come up with what the impacts are going to be and what the benefits of the offsetting mitigation is going to be. So since we don't for sure have a documentation on how we increase the number of bats in an area, nor do we know how many bats are in the area to begin with, it's problematic. So what the guidance tries to do is come up with at least one example of how you may be able to get to the point where you satisfy the requirements of 195D. One of those requirements in 195D is that you provide a net environmental benefit. I'm paraphrasing that. In addition to getting to the point where you are improving the likelihood of recovery of the species that is being taken. So those are two things that fundamentally have to be met. And it's hard when you don't have definitive metrics and processes and methodologies that you can use to get to those things. So what the logic was behind the use of native forests on this is more for making sure that the projects get to a point where you're meeting 195D requirements. So for example, if we are producing and restoring habitat, native habitat for the bats, to an amount that we feel is appropriate, then that's probably going to be addressing the needs for the species as a whole to improve maybe its recovery capability. If that's a native species, then there's going to be more than likely, and it's native habitat that are being produced and native species are benefiting from that, then you're probably going to be well along your way of meeting your 195D requirement for having a net environmental benefit. If you're using non-native plantings to do that, there are instances, because we don't know for sure definitively on a preference of either native or non-native for the bat, you may be able to come up with something that is non-native that may benefit the bat. That's not going to have a benefit to other native species, most likely. You'd have to figure out what that's going to be, and there are very few that I can think of that are going to be benefited by, say, planting eucalyptus or putting in non-native shrublands, for example. So you're going to have difficulty with that, and we were trying to come up with an option that made sense, that could deal with both of those issues. And I'm kind of shortening that whole discussion down, but that's kind of the general logic path as to why it made sense to try to do native restoration as the preferred alternative for a mitigation. Thanks.
Just a quick question, Koa. Do you have a means to identify if Matt or Tom or anybody else from the general public, wants to jump in on the discussion? I'm not sure how to do it. Can they raise their hands, or I want to make sure we don't miss their participation in some of this discussion?
Yeah, if Matt or Tom would like to participate, please raise your hand and chime in when you want.
I would also recommend that you do keep a track of your time allocation, Koa, because we do want to get through all of this stuff.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, if there's no more comments on that particularly, I'll go through the rest of the native reforestation comments, and then maybe there'll be some more discussion overall on this topic. So to that same thought process, there's a comment here that the Gorison paper did not find a correlation with bat activity in native forests, is similar to the previous comment, but also that there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that bats are using open spaces rather than forests. So there's some reference to some mainland studies here showing that bats prefer open spaces. There's an increased consumption of insects in open spaces. And also a study from H.T. Harvey in the islands that suggested that as well.
Comment on that. Again, I think we're getting into the area where there's a confusion between what potential mitigation habitat could be for. Is it foraging habitat, which is open spaces? Is it forested habitat, which is both roosting, nesting, pupping, and foraging? And so they're for different purposes. And I think again, we need to be very clear in terms of how to tie mitigation actions into what those requirements are for habitat and different kinds of habitat. And again, that gets back to what the limiting factors are. So, again, I see some confusion in terms of this comment here, and it just urges us to make sure that we really clarify these points as it relates to mitigation.
Yeah, and I believe later in the matrix, there's a section on what you're exactly saying, Jim, as well. So we may touch on that again. In the same vein, we have the next comment we have here on native forests. Sort of similar, continuing to think of Hawaiian hoary bats as native forest specialists is limiting. So same sort of comment that the species has been demonstrated to forage extensively in open areas and also eat native and non-native insects. And particularly this commenter is saying that we should ensure that native habitats still contain sufficient insects to provide appropriate prey, and that might be something that should more important focus. And it's very possible that some insect species that bats relied on have gone extinct or will not readily return if native trees are planted. And then the comment here that as insectivores, bats are at least one step removed from a mitigation action, to keep that in mind. The recent genetic work that's been done by USGS and H.T. Harvey, barcoding of the material in the fecal pellets identified the insect prey to the genus and species level. So any mitigation proposed by an applicant or a permittee should state the specific insect prey species to be restored and link those restoration plants to act as hosts for these insects. And we'll touch on what was said of the bat workshop about that in a minute. Also that not just forests, but that native and non-native moths are present in shrublands and pasture. So we should not necessarily consider those de facto degraded habitat for this species. That they could provide insect biomass. Something like non-native pine or eucalyptus forest would likely be a more suitable target for restoration than necessarily pasture because of the foraging opportunity there. And so prospective restoration sites should be surveyed for the abundance of suitable insect prey prior to selection, and suitable insect abundance before and after restoration should be quantified. There's also a mention here about suitable habitat at different elevations. So those are all the comments that were on the native reforestation topic. If anybody wants to make any further comments on that.
I would, Lauren, if you have a second. Oh, I see Jim's hand up and I saw it up earlier. He should go first.
Okay, just really quickly, I mean, again, it gets into when you're trying to do mitigation, you know, by habitat restoration and so forth. It's not just simply what species, what structure, but it's also the other components, and particularly, you know, the food resources, if it's going to be foraging habitat, both for forest and even, you know, for foraging areas. But so the insects are a very key part of it, and having our monitoring assessment for potential mitigation sites and monitoring for mitigation action should also, it's really crucial to include the food resource in it.
Just a couple comments, if I may. Going back to Matt's point earlier in the public testimony, I continue to have concerns about establishing a specific acreage. I recognize that this is, the guidance is not, it is only intended to be guidance and not prescriptive. So I think that that does give an out if people want to provide alternative mitigation plans. But I do worry about focusing too much on the area of habitat and instead spending more time talking about the quality of that area and the limiting factors within that area. The presence of prey gets to that. And I can't recall exactly the wording of the current draft of the bat guidance document, but I would suggest that the bat subcommittee go back in and look carefully at the wording of the current draft of the guidance document, make sure that reference to food availability, water availability, and elevation are clearly addressed within the document. As Jim mentioned, food availability, if you're going for a foraging mitigation project, is incredibly important, as is water, I would suspect, and that was borne out by some of the presentations that we heard during the bat workshop. habitat features such as ravines play a big role in the presence of food availability, and I don't know how that is currently reflected in the document, and I would like to see it in there. And then additionally, if we are talking about a pupping location for mitigation, I have heard Frank say a number of times about the elevational requirements for effective breeding, and I think that that plays a part in of mitigation projects moving forward.
Lauren, if I can just layer one thing on top of that. I've come across some more literature more recently on predation too on bats, like for example, by cats. There's a review that just got accepted that's coming out soon. So it's not quite available, but it's a review, so it's pulling together all the literature. So if you look across that, there is a decent amount of support for the idea that adding on to what Michelle was recommending for making sure that the quality of the habitat is maximized, that predator control, particularly cats, but potentially other things as well, should also be included and may benefit the bats within that environment to reduce mortality.
I do understand that bat subcommittees want to focus in on native versus non-native, and I understand how that does play into the 195D requirements. I don't dispute that, but I do want to make sure that these other habitat elements are equally included in the development and mitigation projects rather than just a acreage amount and a native versus non-native vegetation. To me, those are two factors in a larger list of factors that contribute to the quality of a mitigation package. And honestly, I'm not sure if they're the most important of the list. So if we can just make sure that whatever guidance we put out is encompassing them within a larger structure of the quality of mitigation packages and not leading with those two items. Or at least that would be my recommendation.
And I think part of what Matt was speaking to is along those lines, that until we get to a place where we can tie all those different characteristics of a habitat to the gain that it's going to provide for population stability to make up for the losses from the wind turbines, until you can do that, this guidance is just meant to do what Loyola was speaking to and what Jim was speaking to, which is the alternative is just reduce the number of things that are being killed by the wind turbines. And if there's just a given amount that are going to be killed by the wind turbines, then we've got to figure out how to make up for it elsewhere, and we don't know how to do that very well yet. So I hope, Michelle, I like what you're saying, and I hope that we can get to a point where we can have a model that can pull in these different factors and predict for a particular proposed mitigation how much of a gain you're actually going to get, rather than having these standard proxy metrics that may or may not actually correlate directly to gains.
I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think a true model that identifies the specific benefit from each of those factors is probably a long way off, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to get to that desired outcome.
And I think that's the real challenge that I see, and we've been plagued by this right from the beginning, is when you get all those answers, we'll be able to come up with a better understanding, all of us together, in terms of prescription, in terms of how do you offset, take and so forth. We're not there. It's going to be a while before you get there, I believe, too. But what do we do in the meantime? The other option is to either, as has been suggested, is you do everything you can to reduce take. That's really important, but you still will have take. So how do you offset that take? So we need to come up with options that are best possible, and this is what we've done all along. And some of them may have been really flawed when in the beginning in terms of what we had recommended. But we need to come up with options in terms of what to do, as opposed to, the other option is to say no take, and that's all there is to it. So that's the struggle that we have in terms of doing this. And so it really puts an awful lot more pressure in terms of making sure that we do get the information necessary to be able to come up with these ideas and the strategies needed for proper mitigation. and minimization. There's no question. That's a real key area.
I would just say that I see our charge as making the best decisions that we possibly can with the information that we've got in front of us, under the authorities by which we are charged with addressing. And that may not always be perfect. It's never been perfect. But we can and should make the best decisions that we can with the information that we've got. And our guidance reflects that.
Hey, Michelle, I wanted to follow up on that. I mean, my read, and this is probably a better question for Linda, is that 195D provides the state some protections by saying reasonable certainty of increasing the likelihood of survival and reproduction. So, or maybe that's not the exact language, but that reasonable certainty to me suggests we need to be able to show that our mitigation options are supported. We don't need to have absolute certainty that they will have a specific response, and then we need to build in robust adaptive management. And so that's how I view this process going forward. And we have some flexibility. We don't have to be prescriptive. And by implementing mitigation, we will learn and continue to improve. By doing nothing, we will remain where we're at today with a lot of uncertainty.
Matt, if I could follow up on that really quickly, and I know that we're running low on time, but I think the challenge that I have seen in that process is not the implementation of the mitigation project or the attempt at adaptive management. But at the end of the day, adaptive management is informed by strong monitoring of that mitigation project and goalposts by which you would assess whether or not the mitigation project is realizing the anticipated benefits that you had in the HCP. And I think that that's the part that we've really struggled with, is that we're not necessarily getting clear information out of those mitigation projects that we have realized the benefits that we anticipated in the draft documents. It is more nuanced than that, but I think that this is where we struggle to implement adaptive management, is when we don't have clear monitoring that shows where we are in the ability for that mitigation project to meet the need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
There is a challenge there for sure. I see the concept that David Smith discussed at the last meeting, having island-wide monitoring as being a great tool to facilitate that. And then you can compare island-wide monitoring to local results. But I think that's a much bigger discussion.
Agreed.
So to answer Matt's question, I guess to me, I agree that, I think in the world of science, you never have perfect. You're never going to have perfect. And I think the 195D realizes that. And so a lot of the charge of governmental or regulatory bodies like this is that you do the best informed decision that you can, that you have. And I agree with Michelle that adaptive management is the key to deal with the uncertainty. The problem becomes where you have so much uncertainty that you can't even make an informed decision regarding what adaptive management should look like if the current mitigation doesn't work. But in the face of uncertainty, I think you still have to proceed on the best path that you can. And I think that's what the law expects.
So, okay, that's super useful, Linda. When we think about decision making and in the face of uncertainty, adaptive management at its core, if you're doing it right, you need to start by predicting what outcome you think you're going to have. And then your monitoring data should say, is this meeting my mental model, my predictions, my calculations of what we're going to achieve? And I think it's just really key. We've recognized over and over that this is a guidance document and that it should be using best available science. And part of that is, as each of these projects take place, we improve our mental models about how the system works. And so the really important key component is that the bat guidance document as it exists right now is essentially that prediction. It's saying, here's how we think the system works. We think that if you protect X amount of acreage or restore X amount of acreage or whatever, that you're going to see this improvement in bat numbers. And so as we get new information back, as long as our system is set up so we can feed that back in and improve future mitigation plans and conservation plans to incorporate that feedback, then we'll continue to improve outcomes over time. So I just want to emphasize that that prediction component is so key. If we don't take the time to predict, here's the connection we think exists quantitatively between the actions that are going to be taken and the outcomes. If we don't make that prediction, then we can't go back and say, is our mental model correct or incorrect? Or how can we improve it? So that step is just really key, and I want to make sure that we continue to see those in the monitoring plan so that the monitoring data has a place to plug in.
Yeah, I agree completely, but but that also gets back to, we sort of have some dull, not semi-blunt tools as far as monitoring, and I think that's one of the challenges we have, and why there's so much emphasis that we need to put also in terms of improving those monitoring tools, because that's a key part in terms of that adaptive management loop.
Lauren, I just wanted to do a time check. I know we've got a lot of things to cover today. I think that we could probably talk about mitigation for the entirety of the time. We've got enough here to sink our teeth into, but I also want to be cognizant of the fact that there's other things that we need to get to.
Can we do a quick 5-minute? Can we do a quick 5-minute break?
Committee.
When we finish this section here.
Yeah, should we finish the public comments on mitigation section, and then before we do the second two sections, have a 5-minute break? And
That's okay with me.
don't panic, Michelle. I think this is one of the bigger sections to get through. I'm going to go back to screen sharing. Sorry. Okay, so and please do, if there's things that you're hearing in the comments that you want the BAT task force to take back and discuss or definitely incorporate or consider incorporating, please point that out. We've, obviously heard the comments that you've made on this section so far, but you should point that out. I did stop screen sharing there during the conversation so that if anybody was raising their hand, but I can't, if anybody knows, just tell me how to make this big so I can see everybody when I'm screen sharing so I don't miss somebody. But for now, I'll just put you to the side. Okay, so the next section is habitat quality. This one, a few different comments separated out here. There's a comment that this document should emphasize the quality of foraging habitat at different times of the year. So pointing that out. For instance, energy demands during lactation are greater than pregnancy by a significant amount. Also a comment that herbicides as you say in the US, sorry, herbicides have ones that have minimal impacts on insects maybe could be included as a recommendation because of the impact on foraging resources to bats. Any interventions into improving habitat quality or restoration should, aim to improve insect biomass and density. So there was those comments, which I think were similar, touched on some things we might have talked about, but do just, like I said, just unmute yourself and stop me. Those things that we should look at with the BAT task force about including or defer to them. Hearing nothing, we'll take a look at it. Um, a comment here that the studies, hold on.
It's okay. It's a new normal.
Sorry, I'm just moving to somewhere else so that we're not, our computers are back to back, so you're not trying to compete hearing the two of us. So the next comment was the studies that are selected in the paper were sort of selectively picked to support a predetermined conclusion, that there were conflicting findings or recommendations in the document. For example, this comment was made by a couple people. The document recommends ungulate control, but these commenters have said that ungulates are positively correlated with bat activity.
Lauren, can I just ask for clarification? Are they referring to domesticated cattle? My understanding is the studies were done on domestic cattle as opposed to finding a correlation between, say, pigs and feral pigs and bats, but I just would appreciate clarification on that.
Yeah, it's cattle.
Okay, and the guidance is referring to control of feral ungulates or domestic cattle? It just sounds like
both.
Ungulates.
It's tied to the mitigation. And if you're going to be looking for trying to restore native habitat, then you don't want either cows or goats or pigs or deer.
Okay, yeah, it just sounds like it's possible, and I know they're on the call so they can speak to this. It just sounds like there's maybe a conflation of two things. One, that if you're restoring native habitat, which is part of the guidance right now, that you would be removing non-native ungulates, versus a study showing that pasture lands may serve as bat habitat. It's not that they're unrelated, but it seems like the purpose of the two things is different and they're being conflated in this comment. So I'm just opening that up.
Yeah, and I agree. This is something that we need to clarify in the document.
I would agree. If I recall correctly, it's not about the presence of ungulates or not the presence of ungulates. It's about the presence of the insects that are associated with ungulates. And so, by tying our recommendations more closely to the insect presence, which I think is our intent, and taking it away from well, anyway, I'll leave it at that and ask for the bat subcommittee to take a look at that one. But I think the real key here is the insect production and the ability for that habitat to support bat foraging.
Yeah, again, depends on what the purpose of the restoration project is. The other thing that this may come into play is periodically we see some positive and some negative correlations with bat activity and cows, and whether that translates into additional kills at the site of the wind farm is also one of the issues. In some instances you find that, but I think for Oahe, I believe they did not find that correlation. Other places have presumably found that correlation. So there is that aspect of it as well. So that may be causing some of the confusion.
Sounds like that could be something that could be more clearly stated in the guidance. So,
and one thing I would add that we've seen in the past is that when, in particular in the area of the wind farm, nene start becoming an issue when you're talking about pasture lands and wind farm interactions. So I think we really need to word this well, because I don't want, my impression of the research has had to do with domestic cattle and not just ungulates and insects.
okay, so we'll get those comments to the bat task force to more clearly address. Somebody want to speak that was unmuted?
I would, for just a moment here, I think it'd be careful not to confuse those specific studies about cattle and presence of bats, because it's not to say that you couldn't greatly improve upon the habitat by planting structure or native forests and so on. We found that, you know, in those pastures, the bats were eating some of the dung beetles, some things that were associated with manure. But and if you take the cattle away, then those sources aren't going to be there. And I think Chris Todd's work, to our surprise, suggested that, you know, cattle versus snow cattle. Well, the cattle present pastures had more bats, but, you know, I wouldn't say that that would preclude, you know, doing much better than that. So that the comment was made that, you know, let's not confuse these things. Yes, I agree. Be very careful when you interpret those data.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, so so we'll definitely go back to that. Is there anybody else or? Okay, the next comment, where am I? Addresses a recommendation in the paper. To scroll down. The restoration efforts should include, this is sort of in the same topic, should include controlling the impacts of ungulates, removing key invasive species. That recommendation does not explain or make the link between how fencing and ungulate exclusion benefits bats, i.e. which invasive species would be known to negatively impact bat foraging or roosting habitat. So this person wanted some more support for that statement. Okay, so the next, so that was all sort of into habitat quality. The next section of the mitigation, let me see where we're at. The mitigation. Okay, so let's try to finish this by 10. This is kind of a, probably more discussion on this section. So this is about core use areas that were previously in the BAT guidance, still are, but with modified interpretation of the data. So there were a few comments that there's no scientific justification to increase core use areas by from 40 to 97 acres. The Bonacorso 2015 or the guidance document don't support those values. There needs to be calculations in the document for these newly derived estimate, and using the mean.
Lauren, can I just, in the context of these comments, can I just ask for clarification? Because this has come up before. Are we required to have, do things have to be published in the peer-reviewed literature for us to consider them in ESRC? Just want clarification, because this seems to imply that we're only allowed to use peer-reviewed published literature, and it can take a couple of years to get things published. It doesn't mean
quickly that since this paper came out in January, the final report, at least a technical report, has been, hold on, sweetheart, has been released by HT Harvey, and then that would go on for publication from this point. But go ahead, Kavika.
Saying we clarify this at every meeting. I don't think we need to clarify this at every meeting. It's not limited to peer review science. So let's never talk about this again, please. We're wasting time.
There is, however, this statement does have, it's slightly different than the discussion on is it peer reviewed or not, in my mind, in that the data from Bonaccorso includes adults and juveniles and the calculations that they did on stuff. And so what we did in the BAT guidance was look at just the adults. So you can get that, it's using the Bonaccorso et al. 2015 data, but it is using only the adult portion of that. So the criticism, I think, is in this case is valid, not in whether it's peer reviewed or not, that the data actually is peer reviewed, but the subsection of that was used and the calculations that were derived from that is a subsection of that data. So in the BAT guidance, you know, I need to take that and put that into a separate table so that you see exactly what those are. You can get that easily enough from Bonaccorso, but to make it perfectly clear, that needs to be put off and shown as a table or as an appendix for this particular set of calculations. But yeah, we certainly, if we rely on just published data, it would be hard to meet any of the 195 requirements.
So, and let me just say that as a body that's examining different types of information, you can give the information presented to you different weight depending on the circumstances of it. So individually, you may decide that a paper that's peer reviewed has more weight or should be given more weight than one that hasn't been peer reviewed, but you can consider all of it. And it's just a question of, you know, how much weight you want to give each of them based on their individual circumstances.
Thank you, Linda. So I'll just go across the rest of the comments on core use area. And we can have more discussion on that. There's a comment that we should remove in this sentence: doubling the acreage could provide the other half of a bat's habitat need if it was of high quality. The suggestion is to remove the words high quality because preceding statements assert that threats and factors that limit the bat population are unknown, so that quality of habitat cannot be assessed. Also, that doubling of a mean or median is a, quote, logical fallacy. Half the time spent in an area does not relate to half the area. Doubling the acreage is an arbitrary decision point. And more specificity is required to understand how bats are utilizing habitat. So this comment is that, so the statement in the paper is that compensatory mitigation is recommended to consist of 97 acres of high quality, predominantly native habitat, so that the CUA that we're discussing. The comment is that a set acreage protected for perpetuity does not relate to a single bat or bat over time. So that shouldn't be used as a value to, I guess, offset one bat. And generations of bats may benefit from mitigation over time. So I guess that lost or future productivity should be addressed or acknowledged as credit. And then that's all the sort of comments that are on the core use area. I'll just pause if you want to direct any of these to be reviewed by the BAT task force or be included, or any other discussion before I move on.
This is Loyal. The only thing I would suggest is that the way some of the comments were that if we didn't want to double the amount of a core use area to get at the size of a mitigation area, then we would presumably logically look at the entire use area and try to figure out how to restore that or maintain that or something along that lines. And I worry about the practicality of that given the size of the areas involved and how to really determine the amount of overlap that you get in the non-core use areas. So I just bring that up as a question that, and as to how we would go about doing that. But you can of course punt that back to the task force, and I'm sure that the people on that are smarter than I will figure it out.
Hey,
Jim.
Loyal, this is Matt. I just wanted to speak up on this point. So the core use area thing in general is an interpolation. So you're taking a few points and you're mapping a distribution onto it. And so you're interpreting an area based on a subset of a few points. And there's a lot of ways to look at it. I'd be happy to discuss with you offline. It's too technical of a discussion to have right now here in the ESRC meeting. But if you'd like to talk about it offline, I'm happy to do so. I don't know what that looks like in terms of sunshine laws, but it's a fairly technical discussion. And Dave's on the line too. He understands and would probably be valuable in the discussion as well as Chris or Frank, the folks, Jim and the folks at USGS who did the original study. And there are more detailed analyses that we could do in order to better assess how the bat is used, rather than just drawing a big circle around habitat and saying this is the core use area. We can better understand what bats are doing by looking at their behaviors within certain habitats. Are they spending more time in forested habitats? Are they spending more time in edge, or are they moving between certain types of habitat? And how does the change in position over time relate to what habitats and how they're using those habitats? So I think that the number we're deriving, core use area, is a very coarse tool. We're talking about getting to the most precise tools we can. And I think just like we're worried about the monitoring tools, I think that the number, acreage, core use area, is a very coarse tool in regards to what bats are doing in the habitat that they're utilizing.
Just a real quick comment. To me, I think the issue is not so much habitat use. I think that's sort of the background information we need to get into, but it ultimately comes into what is the mitigation? What are the mitigation management actions that are needed to do that can offset take? And so this has always been a real challenging, part of the whole part of the mitigation plan or the guidance. Linda, can I ask you a process question? As far as the BAT task force, I mean, we're careful in terms of how many people from the ESRC are sitting on it. I presume it's permittable to bring in outside people such as Matt, Tom, and Dave, and so forth for their comments on a particular topic, such as this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Good. Okay. Good. So we'll look at that, because again, this is a real challenging part. And ultimately, it comes back to the whole issue in terms of what is the mitigation that we need to do and so forth. So far, that has been sort of one of the key directions we've gone in. But again, I don't think any of us feel very comfortable that we understand it. But we're trying to move forward with the best information possible. But it's again, the more that we can clarify this, the more that we can tie it into limiting factors, and more importantly, as we do management actions, the more we can tie it into monitoring that gives us that feedback is really key on this.
And I think it ties back into the quality versus quantity discussion, right? So if we know that the relationship between home range and habitat quality is the higher the habitat quality, the smaller the home range. And so that feeds back into this. Someone could mitigate through a purchase of a gigantic piece of land, and if the habitat's the quality is super low, it's theoretically equivalent to a really small piece of land that's high quality. So yeah, that's got to play into that discussion as opposed to just a straight area recommendation.
Yeah, and just to your example there, because I think that's another real key point there is acquisition of large piece of area. It's not so much in terms of just doing that solves your problem. It's how that acquisition influences the above background of what bat use is in that area to start with, and that's where really strict monitoring is going to be really key to be able to parse out that piece that actually can be attributed to mitigation.
Yeah, and not just use. So did you not just attract bats from other areas, right? But did you actually increase survival and reproduction in the population, right? To actually make up for the losses that are occurring due to the wind turbines.
Just think how easy things would be if there was no take.
So just to be clear, you know, that what we were trying to do was what we had before seemed to be inadequate. It didn't pass some of the logic tests. We tried to come up with something that we could at least say this is logical, realizing that there is going to be a lot of concern about, well, quality of the habitat, but we don't have, you know, the Bonaccorso 2015 study, which is the basis for this particular set of recommendations in the guidance, is the one that was used for that. And it doesn't give us a good handle on what the quality is. Instead, we opted to say, okay, if they're spending 50% of their time there foraging, it's probably better than the other 50%. And that if you double that and you produce habitat similar to the core use area, then maybe you have created enough resources for the animal to survive. And so that's what we did. And we used average, not median. We used them for the determination of that for a number of reasons that we can bring back to you if you want, or we can discuss them today if you want to do that. But regardless, you know, we were trying to come up with something that was logical. We say, oh yeah, okay, if we get this, we may have the resources for a bat. That does not mean you increased, you know, the population. We still have to go that extra step of validation.
Thanks for that, Loyal. I do appreciate kind of hearing the background of what the committee was looking at and putting that together. I guess I would just reiterate my concerns about an acreage. I would also say that one of the takeaways that I came away from the bat workshop on is that the 2015 Bonaccorso core use area work was incredibly influential to how we have designed mitigation projects over the last couple of years. The work that came out of Maui looking at the core use area and just sheer range of core use areas that individual bats had, in many cases over the same general location of the island, it really challenged my assumptions of what bats need in order to survive. I don't know how to reflect that in the guidance document. I remember hearing, and I have notes in my file about the age of bats and how that correlated to their needs for core use area and how that might affect the territoriality of bats. Again, getting back to what are the habitat conditions within those core use areas and where are they using habitat? Why are they using it the way that they are? Is it food? Is it water? Is it all of those other limiting factors that we don't have a firm grasp of yet, but we know that they exist. None of that makes making guidance all that simple. But I would say that what I took away from the bat workshop is that it's not necessarily an all size fits one approach, and that there may be variations between bat ages, there may be variations between individual islands, there may be variations between habitat quality within different islands about what core range bats may have.
I don't disagree with you. We put together something that, from my perspective, is the minimum acreage that I could logically come up with, or that we could logically come up with for offsetting. Minimum.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, actually, I would like to make a comment here too, just not to delay the discussion, but just as my comment about this point that generations of bats benefiting from mitigation need to be acknowledged. I certainly agree that protecting land in perpetuity is a great mitigation option because it does, for that reason, protect generations of the species and give them some habitat that won't be developed. But to quantify the benefits to future generations, I think is a little shaky, because on the flip side, then you should be quantifying the lost productivity of the take that you have, right? So if you want credit for future bats that you may be benefiting, the other side of that is that your individual take has prevented future bats from being born, right? So just something to think about as far as credit in that. But I'm gonna keep moving on because I want to stay on track for time.
Really quickly, Lauren, sorry not to, but we do that for Nene, right? Where we do quantify lost productivity of Nene, but we also do quantify the benefits to Nene associated with long-term mitigation actions. Is that correct?
It depends on the HCP.
Okay. All right, thanks.
So just something for individual applicants to think about what they propose. Yeah, I think. So research is mitigation. I do think we touched on this quite a bit in the last meeting. So I'm just going to breeze through, but if you have something urgent to say, we can. The comments are that the mitigation value of research cannot be measured by dollar cost. It should be valued in its contribution to the likelihood and extent of bat recovery. The guidance should acknowledge the Fish and Wildlife Service's position on research as mitigation. I believe we did address this in the previous meeting, and we also mentioned not only the service's stance on this, but the fact that 195D has a higher standard of what some standards that need to be met. So, you know, we've stated in the past that research may be something that can get you over that additional requirement. And any land management for the benefit of Hawaiian hoary bats should be given some credit as research benefit. I'm assuming this means in addition to the other ways that land management is quantified as credit, because management actions reduce the uncertainty of limiting factors in bat responses to management. So there's some comments on research. And then the final comment in the mitigation section was about land acquisition, so that protecting land in perpetuity for mitigation. And this person has stated that the proportion of funding is not an appropriate means of assessing the contribution to mitigation. The overall mitigation credit for the parcel should be evaluated, and the funding partners should agree on how mitigation credit is distributed. I think this is maybe more a comment for the regulatory agencies, but if anybody from the ESRC has a thought on that, we can do that now. Michelle?
I would, on that last point about the contribution, the subsectioning of an overall project and what percentage of it can be attributed to mitigation associated with the funding from a mitigation project. I would just say that at least on the Fish and Wildlife Service side, there are legal funding rules that apply here, so it's not that simple. I understand the intent of Matt's comment, and I'm happy to talk about specific issues. I know that this came up with Halimanu. I anticipate that it will likely come up again, particularly related to land cost and restoration costs in Hawaii. But I hesitate to make any strong changes or promises about how mitigation can be partitioned out, because there are very clear funding rules about what can contribute to mitigation and not.
Hey, thanks, Michelle. I wanted to just jump in and discuss this conceptually. And that is to say, like, say you bought mitigation land in 2006 versus 2008, those would be very different costs. But if you agree that the benefit of that land purchased was 100 bats, should the cost difference between the cost in 2006 or the cost in 2008 after the market crash, should that affect the value of that mitigation? It seems to me that it shouldn't. And that's the intent of my comment, that the cost should not be proportional. It should be, we should assess the benefit to the bats as best as we can. And then that should be the basis of the mitigation credit rather than a dollar amount.
Biologically, I fully agree with you. But again, there are certain fiscal considerations here that I can't speak to well without having a specific project in front of us. At least if you want to use Halimanu as an example, certain funding dollar amounts that were used that contributed to the purchase of that property are not allowed to be used for the purchase of mitigation or could not be overlapped with mitigation. So I do think that it's a project by project situation, and it's something that we would need Linda to weigh in on and the Fish and Wildlife Service solicitor to weigh in on.
So, I mean, basically, I think the concept that Michelle is talking about is you cannot double count the same acre for two different types of conservation credit. And that's basically what it is if it's being credited for one purpose, that same amount of land cannot be used as credit for a different purpose, because then you're double counting. And I think that's basically the concept that Michelle is trying to convey, that's the prohibition in a sense. Besides the fact that certain types of funding have limitations as to what they can be used for.
All right, maybe I'm a little confused. Aren't we tying it to acreage and not funding the land acquisition? And the acreage would translate to, the areas that the bats are going to use, which has more of a biological benefit than the funding. So the funding, the cost of acres changes over time, but we're not setting the land acquisition by cost, we're setting it by acreage.
But at the point that you're giving the credit, I think the cost provides a good proportion of the credit that would go to each type of conservation project that is trying to get credit from it. So I think it's sort of a stand-in for the proportionality as well.
Yeah, and I thought, Matt, or the concern was that if it was 1,000 acres being purchased, one person put up half of that, two other people each put up a quarter, but only one of the people who put up a quarter needed mitigation credits for the bat, that they could claim all of it rather than just 25%. So I thought that was the question. I could be wrong, but that's what I thought the question was.
I would see that as just as applicable. So if only one funding partner was contributing or requesting mitigation credit, so long as the other funding partners were not from unallowable sources and we're not double counting the same land for mitigation, the proportion doesn't impact the benefit to the bat. So a person in theory could be donated land, and then that could be used as mitigation credit, and the biological benefit would be the same, them having not spent a single dollar.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yes and no, Michelle.
Yes and no. I biologically, I absolutely see that. I continue to waiver only because there are very specific fiscal rules that, some funders are, okay, I'll just put it this way. If an applicant is planning on proposing a land acquisition purchase and they want to equate that to a benefit to species that meets their mitigation obligation, have early conversations with the agencies about what that might look like, and make sure that we have a pretty good understanding of what the other funding partners are so that we can assess those relative benefits. Each individual other funding partner has their own rules that need to be assessed. It's not as simple as just saying that the other funding partners are not seeking mitigation benefits, and therefore you as the mitigation funding partner can get the biological benefits of the entire parcel for Hawaiian hoary bats. If there is a way to parse out the proportion of the property that is beneficial to bats, let's just say, and there are no other fiscal rules on the books from the other funding partners that would preclude that ability, and there's no double dipping, then yes, conceivably, the agencies could approve a larger amount of benefit for mitigation than just a proportion of the TMK that you were funding. Linda, am I saying that right? Do you want to kick me under the table?
No.
Okay.
Not yet, not today.
Okay.
So no, I agree, because there are certain funding sources, like for instance, when like the Army puts up funding for certain projects, they will not allow the amount that they're funding to be used for anything purpose
else.
Yeah, and so and that's where Michelle is talking about. There are legal restrictions on the use of funds, and it's used for other biological credit, basically. So you just have to look at the overall picture, where your funding sources are coming from, what the restrictions are in place. And I agree with Michelle, early consultation is probably the best idea. And, you know, you put the pieces together and see, you know, what you can come up with as far as the most mitigation credit.
And I would say that most of the funding partners that we work with in Hawaii for land acquisition, they may not be claiming mitigation for bats, but they are claiming some sort of biological credit associated with that land, with that funding contribution. And therefore, there are concerns, legitimate concerns, particularly if the state is also part of the funding arm and they are using non-traditional or traditional Section 6 funds.
Yeah.
So,
I don't think you can parse out the benefit of bat habitat versus, you know, a bird habitat versus some other kind of habitat and say, well, each person can claim different types of credit for that same piece of land. Yeah. So I think that becomes a difficulty too.
So it sounds like the funding source is more important than the proportion.
The funding source is a significant consideration. Yeah.
I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be, but I would continue to advocate that if an applicant is planning on doing a land acquisition purchase and there are other funding partners that are contributing to that land acquisition purchase, you coordinate clearly and early with the agencies so that we can help you assess the relative benefits that meet your mitigation obligation. Really quickly. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No. I was going to go to another topic, but finish up. Good.
I was just going to address the research bat thing.
Oh, I was too. Well, let me just preface it by saying, should we have a section in the guidance that's titled research as mitigation? My understanding is that we should have a section that says research and the importance of research, but is it even a mitigation option? And it sounds like to me that it's not. So I question whether we should have it titled that.
I disagree. I think that for the state, you know, you can, and we've had that already, I think, come up once with Oahe, to be honest, where the state had a slightly bigger ask than the Fish and Wildlife Service, in which case the proponent could propose some research that would be above and beyond the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I don't think you should take it off the table, but we need to do a way better job of explaining the degree that there's a disconnect between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state desires on this.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why I bring it up, because, you know, obviously I'm very much in favor of more research. And if we can do it through mitigation, I'm thrilled with that idea, but you know, it just depends on how that can be done. And so I think clarification of that and identifying exactly where it could be potentially applied in this case would be really important in the guidance document, because otherwise it's very confusing.
Okay. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, I would just say that this seems to be another topic that comes up perpetually every time we talk. And despite my efforts of trying to address the services policy related to research as mitigation, I do think that there continues to be confusion and questions about whether or not we would be willing to look at a research project as compensatory mitigation. And as you all know, it is not a straight shot. It is not easy. It is an extremely high bar for us to reach. If an applicant wants to propose that, we can't stop them from doing it. But by doing so, we are essentially saying that there is no mitigation on the ground that would compensate for bats. So if anyone has any independent questions about this, or if any applicants want to reach out to me about it later, they're always welcome to do so. But I hesitate about making any firm decisions in the guidance document because of those reasons that I've already outlined.
Okay, I was going to go through the remainder of this section with the, because all we have left for mitigation is the findings from the BAT workshop, but I'm not able to share. Oh, I do have screen sharing now. Okay, then let me just go through this quickly and then we'll break and then we'll just have 2 pages left. So the sort of main findings from the BAT workshop were, oh. Sorry. So foraging habitat, Dave Johnston presented on this topic. Some key takeaways were that bats forage in very patchy habitats. Although they have fairly large ranges, they'll select very specific habitats within there. For instance, they might often fly over or past the forest to get to another area where they wish to forage. His conclusion was that it may be more important to enhance a given habitat as opposed to purchasing a set forest or set habitat that may not have the best resources for the species. Bats do need different habitats at different times of the year to some degree, but there are some basic habitat types that they would use year-round, regardless. So foraging range, core use area, those measurements may be less important than actual quality of the habitat. So I think that's sort of been discussed in our earlier conversations today. There's also some evidence that Hawaiian hoary bats select moths, some moths over others. So when restoring habitat and designing intact habitat, these insects host plants should go down to the species level in order to plant those specific plants that will produce those certain prey. Diet studies should be done in some other habitats and on other islands because we only have 1 or 2 studies that may not be representative of the entire state. So there may be some inter-island variation. No studies have been conducted on diet for Hawaiian hoary bats in dry forest or wetlands yet. So that was a takeaway. And then finally, Bob Peck spoke about how you can estimate foraging habitat based on diet, but we do need knowledge of those insect host plants. And then it would be possible to characterize those habitats based on the composition of insects collected and then make that link. So if there's any discussion of that, we'll do that. And then we'll take a break before we do the final section. So I'll stop sharing. Okay. Anything else anybody would like to discuss from those topics in the BAT workshop?
Lauren, I think I just want to reiterate that from an ESRC member perspective, while I value diet studies, I would really like to see any future studies done as a blanket statement, tie things to survival and reproduction and not just the diet itself. So just to be a broken record on that.
I would agree with that.
I would agree too. We just need the tools to do it.
Okay, and that's noted for, it might be something we can incorporate into the recommendations in the paper. Any other thoughts on this section? Core use areas, mitigation? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Here's hoping.
Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break or so. We'll give a little extra. Let's aim to restart at 10:25 unless anybody has any objections. A 9-minute break. Okay, so we'll reconvene at 10:25. If you could please turn off your audio and video while you break, unless you want us to hear what you're doing.
Jim, I've been enjoying this discussion. I've just been staying in the background and staying out of the way, and took a break to eat an apple too, and didn't figure people needed to see that.
Sounds good.
I don't know. I like your other background better, Jim.
Oh boy, I can give you something even more exciting. How's this? Let me try this.
Ah, there we go. Now I don't worry for your safety at all.
I need to wear my helmet.
Yeah, that would help.
All right, if anybody's out there in the Ethosphere, come back, ESRC members.
All right, should we get going?
Hey, Gordon, I'm just getting all the alerts about Cocos.
Yeah, that's sad. That's really sad.
What happened at Cocos?
Oh, they found a brown tree snake, and the suspicion is that it's not a single rogue snake. That there may be a population established there. So,
Not surprising.
just another damn thing for 2020.
It's been a good year.
A good year to look towards the future.
Okay, I think we have everybody. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe Melissa. I'm not sure if Melissa's back. Or if she's just, her video's off. I'll start screen sharing for her arrival. Give her a minute to show up.
Hey, Lauren or Koa, you might want to check in with Teresa, see if she has any comments on any of the sections too.
Hi, this is Teresa. I'm listening. Thanks, Jim.
Melissa, are you there, but your video's just turned off, or are you not back yet?
I'll send her a text.
Thank you, Kavika.
But just in the interest of time, should we just start trying to move ahead?
Yeah, I see her now,
Here.
actually.
She's
Here she
back.
is. Hi, Melissa. Okay, so I'll screen share again. All right, so the next section of the paper is adaptive management. And we put some comment in here from a commenter, which is about the concept of adaptive management for exceeding take. So the first comment relates to a sentence in the BAT paper that is, when the average take rate is determined to be clearly above the permitted level, a short-term trigger is activated that can be used as a check against excessive take over the span of a few years, signaling that the long-term take limit is likely to be exceeded unless conditions change. The comment is that interannual variability in Hawaiian Hoari BAT take rates suggest a project. I'm gonna mute myself for a second.
Mom, we need to go.
I'll start that again. Interannual variability in Hawaiian Hoari BAT take rates suggest a project is likely to trigger short-term thresholds in the first 5 years of a project, regardless of whether the long-term trigger is likely to be exceeded. So the commenter suggests modifying this statement accordingly. Also suggests removing the statement in the paper that an HCP should include a provision that if authorized take is exceeded, turbines will not operate during times when BAT take is possible. So that's a recommendation in the paper that this person suggests removing because DLNR has other options to resolve this issue that are commercially viable. So if anybody has any commentary on that, I'll mute myself.
Matt, can you explain what you mean by other means that are commercially viable for DLNR?
So for both Oahe and Kaweloa, they started the HCP amendment process in 2015 or 2016. If those projects had been shut down at night from 2014, 2015, 2016 to 2019, when their HCP amendments came before the ESRC, it's unlikely they would have been able to maintain the PPA requirements. And I don't know, as a biologist, I don't deal with the project financials. I deal with the secondhand from the clients, but exceedance of an authorized take limit is an enforcement action rather than a HCP, an inclusion in the HCP, maybe.
So once again, welcome to Nuance. I would just say that no, an applicant, if take occurs outside of an HCP, it is subject to Section 9 of the ESA and 195D provisions. So the goal is to try and avoid the situation where they are, where an a project is ever out of compliance. What I mean by that is that if it looks like a project is going to go out of compliance before the end of the permit term, the goal is to try and work on amendment so that the amendment is in place prior to the point where the take is exceeded. Now that's not always possible. And so we have used prosecutorial discretion to say that if an applicant is working on good faith and on an amendment at the point where take is exceeded and they are planning on getting into compliance within the near future, then we are not considering that take exceedance as a problem because that will be incorporated into their updated amendment. But if an applicant was not proceeding with an amendment, was not working on in a good faith effort, by the way, I should be saying permittee rather than applicant, but you know what I mean. If a permittee was not working on a good faith effort to bring themselves into compliance at the point where take is exceeded, then that take is subject to violations under both ESA and 195D.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of there's a few pieces at play here. We have much better tools today than we did when these first HCPs were written. And the other challenge is actually this committee, the ESRC. It meets so infrequently. The feedback that we get from the ESRC takes time to process. And so coming back to the ESRC for approval is a lengthy process. I know both Oahe and Kaweloa came before the ESRC initially when it looked like take would be exceeded. And the involvement, discussions, multiple drafts for each project took a long time to work through. And I don't know how to reconcile that process, with that timeline, but it is a significant hurdle.
Yeah, and I hear you, Matt. I would just say that at least for the purposes of the BAT guidance document, what we do need to get across is that our expectation is that folks work with us about an amendment prior to the point where their take has been exceeded. And I have been deeply appreciative of the applicants that have already done that, and many of them have, because while there was a gap between the point where the take was exceeded and when their amendments were in place, it could have been much worse if they had waited until the point where take is exceeded and then started working on an amendment.
Yeah, and I think that's the thinking behind having a short-term trigger also, in terms of being able to anticipate that.
Okay, let me screen share again. And I will add, in a similar, to Matt's comment, that in those scenarios, I think staff will make a lot of the similar comments that the ESRC does. So do continue to work with staff in between those meetings. And I've said it before to many of the applicants, but you can request the ESRC convene if you have something time sensitive you need to bring. So do reach out. Those are regularly scheduled meetings, but we can request additional meetings in between. And as you all know, in 2019, there was like a meeting every month of the ESRC. So it was a really heavy year for them.
I did want to just comment quickly on that. And also, though, sometimes, I have to bring this up, not all HCPs by any stretch of the imagination, but it is kind of interesting the number of times that we repeat the same recommendations or concerns between drafts for some of the HCPs. So sometimes, we see a draft, we make suggestions, we come see the next draft, and it's just repeating the same original language or slightly changed. So I completely understand where you're coming from, and we need to make sure that we respond quickly.
Sorry, this next section I'm in the Word document. You probably have the PDF. It's bumped across, but this last section will be on this next section will be on Appendix 1, Hawaiian Hoary Bat research, and the comments that were received pertain to the research priorities section. They are suggest revising and providing an updated list for 2020, removing research priorities that have been completed, and removing priorities that do not improve the ability to manage the bat directly. So those are the suggestions there.
So noted, and we're putting attention on that for sure.
Lauren, before we move on from adaptive management, I wanted to bring to the ESRC the question of conceptually, the model we have right now for minimization in HCPs is that we start with the minimum acceptable minimization, and the only direction that minimization can go is up. And I think there are other paradigms that should be considered. One would be starting with high initial minimization and working down. And another would be having variable minimization, where minimization measures could bump up if necessary and move down. And I don't see either of those represented. The comments from the ESRC in the HCP amendment processes kind of suggest that the current paradigm is preferred, but I feel like this is a concept that deserves discussion. And I know in particular, Loyal expressed a concern about reversion triggers. And when I think about a reversion trigger, what I see is that if the ESRC has deemed a certain take level acceptable, that it won't jeopardize the existence of the species. And so a permittee or HCP holder would, in theory, be authorized to take up to that limit. Tiers provide an incentive to stay below that limit. And a reversion trigger is a mechanism by which the commercial operation and the compliance with that authorization, that take authorization, could come into agreement. I understand the perspective that we don't want to maximize our take, but if a certain take level has been authorized, I guess I don't want to say it should be acceptable, but I'm looking for a way that we can find a balance between acceptable and authorized take and appropriate minimization measures. And if there are other means of doing that than a reversion trigger, I'm open to hearing them, but it seems like this is a one-way discussion right now. And I know that applicants would love to hear other options.
This is Loyal. I think it would be interesting to look at exploring this more. I'm not sure exactly how it fits as far as the total take authorization, other than you can't, I don't see a good reason for having an inflated take, for example. I don't think that's allowed. But for what you think I see it being really hard to do unless an applicant is really proposing that they start super high or super heavy and then reverts down to that. Because I think from a legal perspective, I'm not sure how you force somebody to go high on minimization above and beyond what might be legally needed and then back off of that. I'm unclear how it works, but not that I want to throw tons of cold water on it, but maybe this is one of those things that we take offline and you kind of explain to us at some point, Matt, how that might work.
Sure, I'm happy to work with you. I guess another concept that this could be looked at is, I know that there would be an interest from HCP holders that if deterrents are effective and more effective than deterrent, or as effective as deterrence and curtailment, there would be an interest in reducing curtailment if that doesn't increase risk. We have to have a means of assessing that, but this is kind of follows a similar vein.
Yeah, and that makes good sense. Again, we have to check with the agencies to see what their requirements are with respect to whether that's a minor modification or a major amendment sort of thing. But I think that would be great to look at how we build in incentives for people to put in better technology or better minimization efforts, for example. I think that's a big win for everybody if you can do that. So I would suggest that we get together and kind of brainstorm what the options are, but that clearly has to have strong Fish and Wildlife Service and DLNR participation on what is allowable.
I'm going to jump in here and just keep moving along. I don't know if you want to say something, Michelle, but if it's more like agencies comments, then we're getting really short on time.
Sorry, Lauren, can I make one comment in regards to the minimization?
Sure.
I think there should be a heavy motivation on the part of industry to identify innovations in minimization options. Our role as ESRC is to say, is this going to result in some sort of species jeopardy? Is this going to negatively impact the species, or is that plus minus going to work out that's being proposed under the HCP? But it's really the responsibility of industry to innovate in regards to the technology to get that minimization down. And so I think just as far as like motivation and responsibility goes, that we're really looking to industry to do that kind of innovation. And sorry, just want to make that comment. Go ahead, Lauren.
No, that's fine. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to?
I'll just say that I don't know if we can legally require some of those other models met, but I think that we absolutely are open to them. And I agree with Loyal, it's a win-win if we can incentivize additional minimization or changing up the way minimization works over the life of a permit term. So just know that we're open to it. I think ultimately it comes down to what an applicant is proposing in their HCP.
Okay, and we can take some of that conversation back to the BAT task force. Sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
One last thing is that at the end of the day, no matter what an applicant proposes in their HCP, we still have to have sufficient information to evaluate what that might mean in terms of take levels. So to the extent that you can anticipate that that's going to be the question that we put back towards the applicants, that's good to know. Sorry, Lauren, go ahead. I know we're tight on time.
No, that's fine. So the next, so those were the comments. Was there anything on research? I did go through these, but any thought? I think we said we'd go back to that task force with those and review that list. So the final section of the document is the population exercise in Vortex. And just a few comments on here. So the first comment is that general ecology would suggest that a self-sustaining population in a stable equilibrium is likely experiencing density-dependent depression of growth rates. This high-level discussion does not adequately address these problems in how they relate to the models below, meaning the models in that appendix. And there's also a comment on a statement in this section that the Frick et al. 2017 document set an upper bound on population growth at 10 times the initial population size in order to strike a balance between unbounded and overly constrained population growth. And the comment is that the ecological constraints of the mainland hoary bat are distinctly different from the Hawaiian hoary bat, include different seasonal influences, different prey, geographic extent, impacts from migration, etc. And so maybe that isn't appropriate, I guess, to use a mainland data in place of Hawaiian hoary bat data if we don't have that data here. Also that the Frick et al. Paper needs to be placed in context as not using empirical data. There was just a final comment here that the population-based test has no scientific support that cannot be satisfied. Is this written correctly? Population-based test has no scientific support that cannot be satisfied. Basically saying it's limiting any future wind projects in Hawaii and there's no scientific support for this test. So I'll mute myself while you discuss. Or we can push this back to the BAT task force, but if there's anything, I'll go back to the full screen.
I'll just note that I think we've spent considerable time on this item in previous meetings, if my memory serves me correctly.
Hi, this is Teresa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Carrying capacity is usually defined as the population size that can be sustained in the habitat over the long term. And when we modeled an initial starting population of 1,000, we set the carrying capacity to 10 times that amount, like Frick had done, which is why that is referenced, why Matt referenced that statement about Frick. And the reason that those authors did that was to balance between the unbounded growth of the model. Just it would run and run and run, and the population is getting bigger and bigger. We couldn't have models that did that because it took too much time. So we played with different numbers. We found that the idea of setting it at 10 times the initial population size worked really good. If you do the opposite and reduce a population from 10,000 down to 5,000, or it's limited to 2,000, I feel that would overly constrain the population growth. And so you're seeing that the population just doesn't sustain itself over time. It makes the effects of any take that makes the population go to extinction all the more faster, the lower the carrying capacity is, or if you incorporate density dependent models. That's all I have to say.
And the only thing I'll say is if some of the ESRC folks wanted to actually see those models run or kind of play with them, they can, I don't know, in a COVID situation, it's hard for us to figure out how to do that. I'm sorry, but we can certainly have a discussion if you are unclear how some of those models worked. Even though there's a description on them, sometimes you have other ideas as to what if this or what if that. And we probably tried those what ifs, regardless of whether they're in the appendix or not. But if you have questions, you can give Teresa or me a call. I think we can try to run through that with you. Unless somebody wants to redo those on their own and validate them, that would be awesome. That'd be great.
Yes, essentially, we have all of those Vortex files, and they can just be sent out to anybody. And I tried to document where every piece of information, I did document where every piece of information came from on our model inputs. So I am happy to share.
Thank you, Teresa. We can help facilitate the meeting of the minds on that if anybody wants to touch base with Teresa on that, who's watching or listening.
How did you guys come to select Vortex as your population model, and why Vortex as opposed to some other tool?
I have first learned about Vortex from Miss Lisa Spain, who's on the call, back in grad school. And it was the model that I believe Lisa, who was your advisor, Dr. Hadfield was using and I've just stuck with it over the years. I found it user friendly. And it comes with a great user manual.
Matt, did you have another method to recommend? Because Vortex is pretty commonly used for population viability analyses across biologists. And certainly you can write your own code in R and work up something that works for your needs. So it's less of a black box approach, but that tool is pretty commonly used. Did you have another recommendation?
No, I didn't have another recommendation. I just had heard concerns from folks who were involved about the impacts of carrying capacity. And when I played with it, it certainly was. So in the process of working through those two HCP amendments, I tried Vortex and I tried matrix population models. Like you had suggested, we're looking at, where should concerns, like where do red flags pop up? We have some parameters that we can have with relative certainty. We have some where we can incorporate a range, and we have some that we don't have good assessments for. And given what we see, where are our concerns? At what point do they come up? And basically all of my assessments suggest that the reproductive capacity of the Hawaiian hoary bat, or hoary bats generally, is high in comparison to other bats. And when I read through like Kuntz's work, he suggests that some of the limiting factors for other bat species like migration or seasonal needs are probably not present in tropical species. And so we have reason to think like Hawaiian hoary bats have a high reproductive capacity to begin with. They're producing 2 offspring per year. They start reproduction in their first year. So the pieces of the model that stand out to me are not that we have a high reproductive capacity in the Hawaiian hoary bat, and so it's able to recover from ache more quickly, and so the initial population is less impactful, which is why I'm concerned that density dependent effects may be significant. Generally, I think when I think about this project generally, I have a graph on my wall that I stare at thinking like, what happened when the bat colonized initially? We have a starting population, grows through some growth phase, a few bats initially colonize, we grow through a growth phase, and then we would expect the population to reach carrying capacity at some point prior to today, because we fill to the available space. And then as we get all that space filled, we have some limiting factor that's depressing the growth rate. And in an unconstrained model, or in a model where we have the growth, or we have the carrying capacity set at 10 times the initial population, we would expect to see growth to fill, say in the absence of take, we would expect to see growth to fill that remaining capacity at some point. Typically what we see in nature is that a population at a stable equilibrium is balanced on a knife edge, that either that population, or it has a very slow reproductive capacity in the first place, like whales or pandas or something like that. Other than that, typically you get growth to carrying capacity or you get a crash. And so to see a population balanced on a knife edge would be the exception rather than the rule in my mind, which is why I'm concerned about the effects of density dependent depression of growth rate.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think this is a much longer discussion we don't necessarily have time for at the moment. So I'll just note that I think when you're saying great reproductive capacity, I think there's some black holes that we don't know the answer to, such as recruitment rate. And secondly, I would say that 2 pups a year from a cross-species biological perspective, 2 pups a year is not that much. They're really depending on high survival rates in the adult population to maintain stable populations. And because we have a major threat in the form of, or major impact to adults in the form of wind turbines, that's the concern here. And we don't know the factors impacting recruitment of the pups. So I would just note those 2 things. But yeah, I think that's a much longer discussion, maybe for another day.
Sure, I agree. There's a lot to this.
Just a few very short comments. I'm not a population ecologist, but I have to say that, I'm agreeing with you, Melissa. I wouldn't call this a high reproductive potential species. The foliage roosting bats typically have 2 young, but they're far more exposed than most species of bats living, day roosting in the foliage of trees. And for other species of foliage roosting bats, like western red bats, there is a huge decline in that species, at least in the western US. I just filled out a population, well, it was for the IUCN in terms of how how I determined what that population is, but I think that species is in trouble. We know less about hoary bats, but another point, I wouldn't say that tropical bats don't migrate. Many tropical bats migrate. The Hawaiian hoary bat probably does not migrate in the sense of what we call migration. And then thirdly, I wouldn't say that their diet is much different than the mainland bat. In fact, they're quite similar. They're different species, but a moth at a certain size, like let's say 11 to 14 millimeters, that's going to be very similar to the moth on Hawaii. And so what we find in the mainland hoary bat is that its diet varies considerably according to season and also geographic location. In some areas, they eat a lot of dragonflies. So I would say that, the two species are quite similar in their diet. Anyway, that's it.
Thanks, Dave. If there's any more discussion, we can, and I'm going to hand back to Afshin at this point to resume running the meeting.
Sure. Okay, if we're good with those comments that and discussion on the back guidance, then I'll end that item unless somebody wants to make another comment just regarding the back guidance. If there's any other discussion, we have a little bit of time if anyone wanted to bring up anything else. Okay, so hearing none, the only thing we have left on the agenda, which I think we mistakenly skipped, was the approval of the minutes from March 5th. So I'd open up the comments from the committee if they had any comments on those meeting minutes that were distributed.
Afshin, I did see Jim's hand too.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
After you finish the minutes, I'll come back to it.
Okay.
Did we get a revised minutes? I'm sorry, I didn't see those.
Yeah, I believe it went with the agenda. Lauren, can you confirm that?
Koa, I believe, sent it out. I don't know the date offhand.
Yeah,
So
I sent them.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say I sent them out. The minutes were in the same email as the comment matrix, so there should have been 2 attachments with that one email.
The differences from the minutes that were brought at the September 30th ESRC meeting were that one of the presentations, Dave Johnson's presentation, had some edits to his transcript. Otherwise, it was the same. So it was just cleaning up some of the language in his section.
I would move that we accept the minutes as modified.
I second.
Okay, so then we should vote on that. How do we, sorry, I forgot how we voted on Zoom.
So usually you ask for any other comments before we vote.
Okay, any other comments? This is from the public, I assume. Yeah, so are there any comments from the public?
And since we can't vote by using the chat box, I think we just have to raise our hands.
Okay, so by a show of hands, how many people are approving the meeting minutes? So I see everyone is voting yes. Are there any no's? Okay, great.
It looks like Kavika's not on the call unless I just don't see him. He might have dropped off. So
Yeah,
I would put
another meeting.
I would put him as for the record that he did not vote.
Absolutely.
He's not present for the vote.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so we will move forward with approving those minutes. And then I don't have anything else. So Jim, if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the guidance document. I just wanted to ask the SRC, I mean, you know, what is your charge to the task force in terms of a timeline to get this back to the SRC, you know, meeting? So we know when to shoot for and how to get it on, get it to a stage where it can be on the agenda properly.
I think we discussed this at the last meeting, right? And I don't know where we ended up. So I'm hesitating just because I don't want to say something different than what we decided last time in terms of process.
Michelle, maybe we can remind us what we decided last time.
That's the problem. I don't recall.
Don't have the minutes.
So it's the 21st of October today. Bearing in mind that the revisions need to be made and then giving that larger lead time for the document, you know, the 30 days, because there will actually be some substantive changes for the committee and the public to review. Should we look to schedule something in the first week of December, so that we would be sending something out to the committee in November?
Is that realistic for the committee?
Committee? That task force committee, I mean.
Well, Jim may want to weigh in on this too, but I think it really, I mean, there's some things that are going to take some time to either have DOFA or the committee revise. The most important one is probably the ones that we discussed and then we talked about at the last BAT task force meeting. The one I'm most concerned about from a time perspective is the monitoring program. And so I would want to know whether there was any thoughts that the full ESRC had on what the goals of monitoring for activity, on-site activity, for success of the mitigation offset stuff, those two in particular, what if they had any thoughts on what the goals should be, because that is going to drive the costs and the extent of the monitoring. If you want to be able to see and show statistical changes in activity levels, that's very different than just presence absence sort of stuff. So if you guys had any sort of major preference on what the goals should be, if they're different than what's kind of in the guidance document, that would be really useful, because that's going to be the hardest part to write or rewrite, I think.
I think we can maybe address that in the document by saying, here are the gold standard that we'd like to shoot for, but we realize we've got blunt tools right now. And as those tools get sharper, we can better approach that. And so, you know, again, this is not prescriptive, this is more guidance. And so I think we can write it up with what we have right now, recognizing the limitations of what the monitoring is, and that's going to be a real challenge, because it's going to be a while before I think we can be much more definitive and very statistically rigorous on it. So, you know, again, I don't think it's a one way or the other kind of a thing. I think it's, you know, we need to, you know, state what we'd like to have, but this is what we have, and this is what we have to work with right now too. And I think that's the best way to approach that part of it.
Well, I think it'd be nice to know if there were thoughts on the goal. In other words, what the goal of activity monitoring at the site is, or pre-construction monitoring, and what the goal of the monitoring is for the mitigation, what you're trying to actually be able to show, because that's going to drive things. And if you can't put together a monitoring program that meets those, then should you be requiring monitoring at all?
And it seems like the service and DOFA have got specific requirements probably that have to be addressed at least.
I agree, but are there things that you, as an ESRC member, you want your task force to be focusing on as to your objectives that you want to see based on what your knowledge is of Fish and Wildlife Service and 195D? If not, we'll just,
And I would just say that the activity monitoring on the site, my understanding is that the main purpose of that is that we can track whether or not there's localized extirpation of the species at a site. And I don't know how extensive that monitoring needs to be in order to be able to get at that question. I would defer to those of you that have much more extensive monitoring experience to help answer that. But in my mind, that's the one main value of that on-site monitoring, is whether or not we're seeing localized extirpation of Hawaiian hoary bats at that site. And I think up until now, we have not seen that. And we have also not necessarily seen dramatic decreases in take that are not associated with the implementation of minimization measures. But I could be wrong, so take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think the on-site monitoring also, depending on how it's done, could also serve as a backdrop in terms of the effectiveness of deterrence. And again, it's going to be a sample size issue. That's going to be the challenge there. But I think that's the other thing that I see it could potentially be applied to.
Well, and if you want to use it for that, then there's even more. I mean, there's sighting, there's timing, there's sample size, there's all of those things that would have to go into it. And at the end of the day, I would still want someone to actually be able to tell me whether or not there's going to be enough data coming out of that that gives us a robust enough answer to determine whether or not deterrents are working or not. So that's the on-site monitoring in my mind. For the mitigation monitoring, at the end of the day, I think that we have to acknowledge that it's never going to be quite what we want it to be because the tools just aren't there. But that being said, I think that to the extent possible, it should, the monitoring needs to be tied to whatever the biological goals of the mitigation project are. So if your mitigation project is specifically attempting to work on foraging ability, then the biological goal should be tied to that, and there should be sufficient monitoring to inform whether adaptive management needs to be implemented to modify that project. If the project is specifically for pupping, then what we're always looking for is whether or not the monitoring is actually robust enough to help us assess whether or not the mitigation project is realizing the anticipated biological value that we permitted at the time that the HCP came before us. And I fully agree that that is hard to do, but that's what we're trying to strive for, right?
Could you rephrase that? Because I didn't quite understand it, Michelle.
The monitoring should be sensitive enough to drive adaptive management. To the extent possible. Because at the end of the day, when we get into the compliance monitoring for each of these projects, every year we are trying to assess whether or not the mitigation project is realizing the benefits that we anticipated it to have.
Okay, and for the first one, you're just looking at presence absence, not trends for the activity monitoring.
I mean, I would defer to ESRC, and I mean, I don't know if we have enough. Do we have enough to get at trends? there's so much year-to-year variation.
Well, my question is, what is your objective? Do you need a trend or do you just want presence absence?
Well, I mean, what we're looking for is we're looking for an objective or at least a goal, and we may not be able to realize it as yet, but it's, you know, this is what we're shooting for. And if we don't have the tools for it, we'll have to settle for something less than that. But we still, it's good to identify what that ultimate tool is, you know, goal is that we're shooting for.
Unfortunately, that AG had to leave for another meeting too, because this may be something we can get clarification on that in 195D, the monitoring requirement.
Yeah, monitoring requirements are laid out there. It's just I'm looking to see if there was something that your interpretation was different than what ours might be reading 195D.
Loyal, I would just say that on the federal side, I think that from a legal perspective, we would need at least presence absence, but I don't know if, certainly a trend would be nice to have, but I need to go back and talk to Darren and Becca a little bit more about whether or not we need it.
Okay, thank you.
Legally need it for permit issuance criteria.
Okay.
Darren says he's looking into it.
Other thoughts from the committee members on goals, objectives of monitoring? I mean, if not, we can just work with what we have.
Yeah, we probably will explore what Dave Smith was talking about. The advantages of having an island-wide system of monitoring and how that would tie in potentially.
As a side note on that, I know that there was a detailed meeting, I think with West, I think 3 or 4 years ago, that tried to plan out what that would look like. Rather than starting from scratch, it might be worth dragging up those notes and starting from there.
As I recall, there was a proposal they put together that we all, including them, saw some serious limitations in terms of sample size, given the status of tools and information at that time. But that's a good starting point. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Joel also mentioned an update to that power analysis at the BAT workshop based on their observations over the last few years.
Yeah, this is one thing that potentially we could bring a few other people in for the discussion with the task force to look at, non-ESRC members.
I know that Michael from BCI had some thoughts on this, so it might be good to reach out to him on that one as well.
Yeah, so that's the only topic that I'm worried about getting done in November is the monitoring. The rest of it, I think, is doable without large amounts of extra work.
Yeah, realistically, I'm just wondering if we might want to shoot for having this come on the ESRC agenda on our January 20th meeting. That would give us a little bit more time to clarify things and to get a more complete draft document out to everyone before that meeting in adequate time.
I agree with that timeline. It gives us a little bit more time, I think, to explore these things that we need to. All right, and anyone else have anything they want to add or comments?
Okay.
All right.
Nothing for me, thank you.
Okay, then I think we can adjourn for today. And I guess our next meeting is in January. Is that right, Lauren?
I thought you had mentioned you're going to try and schedule one, possibly even two more before the end of the year meetings. Is that correct?
Well, that was if we were going to revisit the BAT paper.
Okay.
January meeting, it could still happen, I guess. The January meeting we've tentatively slated for the 20th. And then also annual reviews, or potentially we could do the annual reviews before the end of the year, those two back-to-back meetings.
Lauren, don't forget that we were going to try to set up, hopefully in November, a Kauai Seabird Day, which would hopefully be about a half a day to have two presentations by Pacific Rim Conservation as well as Kauai Endangered Seabird Recovery Project, and then also a briefing by KIUC's contractor on how they're developing with their HCP that is in draft.
Okay, so maybe expect that meeting then in November.
Yeah, I'll send out a doodle poll.
Yeah, Loyal, unless you think we can get done faster with the draft. I mean, I'm just trying to give us a little bit more breathing room to make sure we had it properly addressed.
Well, again, the only section I think is problematic is the monitoring section. So, I mean, as far as getting that timeline done, there's still a lot of work to be done on the others, but that one seems to be particularly difficult because of the limitations on monitoring techniques, being able to show the level of sensitivity you need to drive adaptive management.
Right.
My only thought with January too was it gives that 30 days, you know, bringing that out to the public and the committee to review ahead of time.
Yeah, it gives us a little bit more time to get that, to meet that. Right?
Okay, well, I guess I'll put a motion to adjourn unless anybody has anything else.
I would second that.
Okay, and then
And I just wanted to say thanks to everybody, you know, both on the committee and others who are, you know, participating off the committee for all your input and discussion. I think this has been very productive, and I think it's going to give us what we need on the task force to really put this document together, a draft that we'll bring back and hopefully will be acceptable.
And I would like to really thank Lauren for all the effort and work that she did on this. It was just a pleasure working with her, and we wish her all the best of luck going over to work with Michelle.
Yep.
Not that she'll need it.
Thank you, Loyal.
okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Hello.
Aloha.
Thank you.